Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 47 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Columbus Blue Jackets and lost by a score of 4-1. And so it was nice while it lasted, the mini offensive breakthrough that the Sharks had the other night against the Detroit Red Wings. But now back to our regularly scheduled programming as the Sharks put up just one goal in this loss tonight against Columbus. And there are a couple of things that I do want to get into before discussing this game. The first of which is answering the question of why the Sharks have seemingly been so inconsistent over these last few weeks. Tonight, a game in which the Sharks seem to have sleptwalked through the first couple of periods. Then just last week against the Utah Hockey Club, an uninspired performance seeing the Sharks lose 2-1. And then a couple of weeks prior to that on New Year's Eve, again, a very just lack of energy in that game against Philadelphia. And it does beg the question, why is it that seemingly the Sharks' performance levels have really been oscillating up and down over these last few weeks? And it goes to an answer that Ryan Warsofsky gave to a somewhat similar question a few games ago in a post-game press conference, which was essentially discussing how now that we are at the post-holiday break, or at the moment in the middle of January, teams have really begun to figure themselves out and figure out in particular where they want to be by the end of this season. In the earlier parts of the year, October, November, teams are still trying to gel, put the pieces together, and get back into a groove after a long off season. So the Sharks were able to catch certain teams by surprise and play up to their level. But now, when they go up against these hungry, motivated teams that are in a playoff position or are looking to strike and get into a playoff position, the Sharks just seemingly can't keep up. And that is the exact spot that Philly and Utah were in, just a few points out of a playoff spot. And here tonight, Columbus is currently in a wild card spot, but they've got teams like Montreal, Ottawa, and Detroit nipping at their heels. So the Sharks, it puts them kind of in a tough spot here where if they're not bringing their A game, they can be sure that the other team is. And that's why it ends up looking a lot worse. The other thing that I want to discuss is the Sharks' offense, or really the lack thereof. I've discussed this many times in the past, what has been the major issue for San Jose this season, so why not bring it up yet again? Because it is not so much the forward group that I'm going to blame throughout this entire season. Obviously, it can use some work and some more consistency, and this is not a forward group that you would be confident heading into the playoffs with, but it is workable, it has some talent, and it should be scoring more goals than it currently is. But the major problem for the Sharks comes from the back end, the blue line. We know how many issues they have defensively, but they also have a lot of issues actually helping the Sharks offensively. Taking a look at the Blue Jackets side here tonight, we have one of the best defensemen in the league this season, Zach Werenski. He came into this on with 50 points on the year. He put up yet another one here tonight, so he's right up there, if not the leading scorer amongst defense, and we could see the value he was able to bring on the ice, not just from a defensive perspective. He was just completely stonewalling the Sharks in the neutral zone, felt like as though he was breaking up every possible play that the Sharks were trying to go for, which is why in those first couple of periods, San Jose really got much of nothing doing in the offensive zone. But it was also offensively how he acts as that fourth forward on the ice, how he jumps into the play, he makes these rush chances happen. He's someone who can block a shot 200 feet away from the opposing team's net and then join the rush on a 2-on-1 and score a goal all the way across the ice. He's that type of guy for Columbus, and the Sharks just don't quite have that. Sure, they have Jake Wallman, and he certainly does his best, and I like his skill level that he is able to display at the blue line. He makes some nice little skating moves, but he doesn't really have that high level of vision and playmaking ability that can truly set things up in the offensive zone for San Jose. But even just moving past Jake Wallman when the other defensemen are on the ice, which is easily over half of the game, guys like Ferraro and Ruda just don't have any sort of capability of making a play happen. And so that puts so much of the offensive burden on the three forwards on the ice, how much they have to work. And what makes it even worse is that the other team is fully aware of this fact. They're perfectly fine with giving Ferraro and Ruda and Vlasic a slightly more room to work with, give them that extra half a second to actually make a play, because they know that they're not going to get burned by doing this. What is Ferraro going to do with a little bit of open ice? Probably not much. And so they can kind of overcompensate on defending the Sharks forwards, and that really shut things down unless those forwards can play absolutely perfectly in sync. And obviously, outside of the Sharks' top line, with players like Celebrini and Eklund who have the skill level to do so, many, if not every other Sharks line, doesn't quite manage to pull that off. Now, moving on to how this game played out, as I mentioned, the Sharks really sleepwalking through the first 40 minutes of this game. Felt as though they didn't really show up to play all that much. First period, it is Columbus who racks up a couple of goals here, that one being from Fantilli and Johnson, so two of their younger guys, makes it 2-0. In the second period, the Sharks get even less doing. I think they only had like one or two shots in this period, and not even particularly dangerous ones on net at the very least. They had a couple of okay looks that ended up going wide or getting blocked, but still. And it is Van Riemsdyk who makes it 3-0 heading into the final frame. Now, at the very least, in these last 20 minutes, the Sharks did wake up a little bit, started skating more. The Blue Jackets, it's kind of like a score effects type of situation, so they let off the gas a little bit, which allowed the Sharks back into this game. And at the very least, they did ruin Merzlikin's shutout here tonight with this goal from Tyler Toffoli, his 17th of the season. But that would be the only goal scoring that the Sharks would manage to do in this game. And eventually, it is a Van Riemsdyk empty netter that makes it 4-1 and finishes it off. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line, which I normally have written as Granlund, Zetterlund, and Graf. I think on like the game sheet that is considered to be the Sharks' first line. I guess perhaps because Granlund does get the tougher matchups defensively, but I could not possibly justify not having this Celebrini line as the Sharks' number one line, because obviously they are relied heavily on to produce offense, to produce energy for this team, and they were by far the Sharks' best line here tonight. It's not even remotely close. If these guys were like 8 on 10s here tonight, I don't think any other player could have even hit like a 6 on 10, maybe a couple of guys. That's just how much better these three were than everybody else. And it, of course, starts with Macklin Celebrini. He does pick up a point here tonight, so that is definitely good to see him get rewarded for his efforts, but it's kind of like in the previous one against Detroit, where even looking past the point totals, you can see just how much offense he's able to generate, and it started from pretty much like the first shift of the game, or first or second shift of the game, where he gets a great chance in front to Tyler Toffoli, who somehow manages to end up fanning on this shot. Rare that you see Toffoli flub that one. I guess we did kind of see that in the earlier parts of the Detroit game as well, but still, it's a situation where Toffoli has been in many times in the past, and he's usually able to bury in that spot. So while Celebrini only does get the one assist here tonight on the one goal that the Sharks scored, he probably could have had 2 or 3 at the very least with how well he did play here tonight. Definitely the Sharks' best forward on the ice. And close second, and maybe competitive with him, was once again William Eklund, who continues to have immense chemistry with Celebrini, proving these two players to be pretty much inseparable. I could see the kind of motivation for Warsofsky to maybe want to do so, simply because the rest of the forward lines are doing so poorly that maybe you want to kind of spread the love a little bit to find their game, but it still feels as though it would be a detriment to the team to separate these two, especially if you're kind of looking forward towards the future. It's not so important that the Sharks find perfect lines here, because a lot of these guys that are currently with the team are not going to be with the team in even 2 to 3 years, but Celebrini and Eklund definitely will, and if that can be a long-term duo for the San Jose Sharks, why not start to develop that chemistry here and now? And it does seem like that is going to be the case, because they play very similar style of games that perfectly complement each other. Very hard workers. They skate hard. They play hard. They've got some skill level to them. They're beginning to really realize where each other are on the ice without having to take much of like a second glance at the other player. So it has been great to watch these two. They've been the best Sharks players on the ice for these last few games. And then it comes to Tyler Toffoli, and I haven't usually been much of a fan of Toffoli in this position. I wasn't sure if he'd really be able to keep up with the level of talent and in particular the level of speed that both of these players bring, but I do have to give a lot of credit to Toffoli here tonight. He definitely was not just a third wheel here, but actually brought a high level of play to this game. He was working it extremely well in the offensive zone. He was making moves, and of course he was also getting himself to those positions to actually score goals. I had the early one that I mentioned that he missed out on, but then of course he does score the goal in the end in the third period for his 17th of the season. So I don't know how much of a long-term solution it is to have Toffoli on this top line. I don't know if it's going to just continuously also work out, but hopefully it can, because this was a great game for him. And then when it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Granlund, Zetterlund, and Graf yet again. And I talked about in the previous game against Detroit how this line only got their first shot on net at the halfway mark of the second period, so 30 minutes into this game, but at the very least they had like a decent level of defensive play. Graf was pretty noticeable in that one. Here tonight, far from that, actually. They still generated pretty much nothing offensively, but the somewhat shining spots of like Granlund and Graf were not even remotely apparent here tonight. These three players did absolutely nothing, it felt like, throughout much of this game. In the third period, I'll give them credit. There were some openings, but especially those first couple of periods, it was just not enough. And in particular, you take a look at Mikael Granlund. I've talked about this at length, how he has really struggled for the last month and a half at this point, but at the very least, there have been like a few games here or there where he shows some effort, he plays decent defensively, so you're not like so disappointed. But here tonight, it's just simply the case of Granlund needs to be better. For someone who the Sharks were perhaps looking to try and like give that extra contract to be that veteran presence moving forward over these next couple of years, I don't want to say he's kind of lost that necessarily, but it's becoming slightly more difficult to justify if this is now the long-term performance that we're going to get from Mikael Granlund, because he's now no longer playing like a number one center in the NHL. He's like barely a third center in his performance here tonight. So again, he just simply needs to improve and needs to be better. Then when it comes to his two line mates, Colin Graf, I liked Graf's performance in last game against Detroit, as I mentioned. Here tonight, though, there really wasn't much of anything, and we actually saw Warsofsky make a substitution in the third period of this game. Graf was dropped to play on the third line with Wenberg and Cunnin, and Smith got bumped up to Granlund and Zetterlund. I thought this was the correct decision, and I thought this was really where Graf was going to eventually end up after getting some time with Granlund and Zetterlund, getting some time with Celebrini and Smith. It feels as though Graf is more so built to be that third line type of player, at least at the moment in the earlier parts of his career. He plays a relatively responsible defensive game, but he just doesn't quite have that offensive skill set to play currently in the Sharks' top six. Once he got that opening there in the third period, he looked a little bit better, but still it's not great, and so we'll see how maybe he does in the next game if he remains in the lineup, which I imagine he should. Then when it comes to the final player on this second line, we have Fabian Zetterlund. I didn't necessarily hate Zetterlund's game tonight, but again, it does also need to be better. He's maybe not quite the same level of pressure shouldered on him like Granlund does, considering Granlund was considered to be the Sharks' best player through the first month and a half, 2 months of this season, but Zetterlund is still considered to be like the fourth, fifth best forward here. He's still a 50-point type of guy that you're hoping from him, and this level of performance here tonight was just not great. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Wenberg, Cunnin, and Smith. Now, we've seen Warsofsky go through many different lineups thus far this season, a ton of different lineup combinations. Pretty much every other game we have some changes being made. This trio here of Smith, Wenberg, and Cunnin is probably one of like the worst conceptually, just based on the type of players that these three guys are. You take a look at Luke Cunnin. What is the way that he wants to play this game? He wants to dump this in, get on the forecheck, throw the body around, play with some pace here, and not necessarily set up some great plays, but just kind of crash the net and hope to get a goal. But neither of the two other players here actually play in such a fashion. Wenberg and Smith have like similar levels of play styles, but they're both in a situation where they would want to have a third player who plays in a particular style of way, which is someone who plays with a lot of speed, which Cunnin does admittedly have some of, but also with a good amount of skill to finish on the plays that Smith and Wenberg can set up. But now with just Luke Cunnin here, you're kind of in this weird spot where nobody is actually going to be like a good shooter in this trio, so it feels as though it doesn't really work from the get-go. Having said that, from an individual standpoint, I tweeted this out during the game, I actually thought Will Smith played rather well here tonight, and I mentioned how he was the Sharks' best forward outside of Celebrini, Eklund, and Toffoli, of course. Now, this isn't saying much. There wasn't a ton of competition for this title because, as I mentioned, Graf, Granlund, Zetterlund, very uninspired performances, but it was still good to see, considering Will Smith, it was just a couple of games ago against Minnesota where he was actually benched for pretty much half of the game, but it seemed as though Warsofsky recognized that improvement. As I mentioned, he was swapped onto the line with Granlund and Zetterlund, and what I really liked about Smith here was not only was he actually handling the puck significantly better than usual, a lot of the times he's bobbling these ones here tonight, very, very few moments of that, but he was also continuing to try and go for those aggressive plays. I talked about in that game against Detroit, where I mentioned he had made that mistake in the first period along the wall, where he tries to make a play to actually get this puck out of the zone with possession instead of just dumping it out, and I talked about how Warsofsky was in this tough spot because you don't want to remove this type of effort from Smith's game, but you also want to make sure that he's not making that many mistakes. Well, here tonight, he still went for those aggressive moves, but they actually worked out. There were times where he was skating along the Sharks' offensive blue line, dangerous area, but he actually gets past the couple of stick checks, gives himself some space to make a play. There were moments where he's toe dragging a guy to, again, give himself some space to make a play. And so Smith, he actually had some relatively close calls here tonight. Again, it's not saying much. At the end of the day, his performance is probably only like a maybe 5 on 10, 6 on 10, but that's better than pretty much every other forward here tonight. When it comes to Wennberg and Cunnin, I didn't hate Wennberg's game, but it is a Wennberg style of game, so there's not much more to say about that. And then when it comes to Luke Cunnin, it's a tough spot because at the moment with the Sharks players that they have, as long as they're not calling anybody up from the San Jose Barracuda, somebody here with the injuries there has to play up into the top 9, and Cunnin is very clearly the best option because you don't want Goodrow here definitely, and you don't want Dellandrea here. It's just that Cunnin kind of lost a little bit of that scoring touch that he had maybe a few weeks ago, and he feels as though he would be better off in a fourth line role, but again, the Sharks just don't really have anybody else for this spot, so here he is. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, I was actually relatively impressed with these three players. Again, it's not like you're getting some exceptional efforts from these guys, but they're doing their things. They're making plays happen on the ice. They're getting into the offensive zone. They're maybe getting like a shot or two here or there. But as I have mentioned before, the goal of a fourth line is not so much to put up tons of offense, but it is to generate a little bit of energy, generate a little bit of zone time, and just make it so that they don't get scored on when they are on the ice. And I thought they did a pretty good job of that. I do want to once again highlight Barclay Goodrow, who actually had a relatively decent game here tonight. Not one that lacked mistakes necessarily, but one that was like relatively solid. And again, it goes to the point of please keep him on the Sharks' fourth line. And then when it comes to the Sharks defensively, we have Wallman and Ceci. The thing about the Sharks defense tonight is that I actually didn't think it was maybe as awful as some would expect. You know, you take a look at the shot total here tonight, and of course the scoreboard, you're thinking this is yet another completely terrible game for the Sharks defense, but I thought they did some okay things. Obviously it wasn't great, but from their usual level of play, it was maybe slightly better. We start off with the top pairing, where I was actually a big fan of Wallman's game here tonight. I thought defensively he was actually rather solid, and then offensively it goes back to something that I mentioned earlier on, which is that he does have that skill level to make plays at the offensive zone blue line. He can deke out players there who come out and try to challenge him and make them look a little bit silly. The thing is that there just isn't a ton of follow-up to that for Wallman. Once he does get free, it usually amounts to just like a slap shot on net, which is fine. It can go in, but it is relatively low danger, and he just doesn't quite have that playmaking ability to truly make this a very dangerous player on the ice. I was still a fan of what Wallman was able to do here tonight, but it kind of is not necessarily a missed opportunity, but it does leave you wanting a little bit more. And when it comes to his defensive partner, Cody Ceci, there were some mistakes here tonight. I do think it was a little bit better than where he was at in the other game, or the other night against the Detroit Red Wings, but it does feel as though he has taken a little bit of a back seat compared to now being back with Jake Wallman here, now that he doesn't really have to step up in all that big of a way, which is slightly disappointing because I thought he was doing some decent things when he was paired with Thrun. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing of Ferraro and Liljegren, they had a really, really rough start to this game. There were many mistakes, in particular from Liljegren, I would say. You take a look at this second goal from the Blue Jackets from Kent Johnson. This is actually a decent play from Ferraro. He gets free from the forechecking player for the Columbus Blue Jackets. He makes this pass to Liljegren. Maybe you could blame Ferraro and not getting enough juice on this pass, but it felt as though Liljegren just kind of overskates in this situation, lets a man in front of him, and then that creates that chance and that goal for Kent Johnson. So it was just a little bit of a lack of connection there between these two players, which is a little bit of a surprise considering they have played together a lot over these last couple of months. They did improve as this game wore on. The third period was rather solid for them, but the start is, I won't say inexcusable, but pretty bad. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we do have the tragedy of the night, which is Marc-Edouard Vlasic. He plays in his 1300th game. He was 3-0 on the season thus far since returning from injury, but he does get his first loss here to Columbus, now 3-1 on the year. So unfortunately, the Marc-Edouard Vlasic luck does manage to run out. Vlasic's game here as well also struggled a little bit early. There were definitely some mistakes that he made. Pretty bad giveaway on the, I believe the first goal, if I'm not mistaken, or at least a really, really great chance for Columbus. So that was a bit rough to see, but he settled in a little bit as it went on and didn't end up having the worst game ever. And then when it comes to Jan Rutta, it's, we see on this first goal by Jan Ruda, it's exactly the point that I talked about when I was discussing the lack of offense from the San Jose Sharks coming from the back end, because they get this puck to Jan Ruda in a decent position, but the play that he decides to make is just a slap shot that's not even towards the net, just maybe trying to get it back in deep, and again, putting the onus on his forward group to really make all of the plays, and it ends up just being an easy giveaway for the Blue Jackets to pick this one up and then get the 2-on-1 going for themselves. So a mistake from Jan Ruda, who honestly did not have a very good night at all. And then finally, we have the Sharks goaltender. It is Georgiev yet again. So now, over the last 5 games for the Sharks, Georgiev has started 4 of them. And the only one he did not start was the second half of the back-to-back against Minnesota. So what we see here from Warsofsky is that Georgiev is being treated as the San Jose Sharks starter, which is a pretty clear indication in my eyes that the Sharks very much plan to have Askarov head back down to the Barracuda once Vitek Vanacek is healthy yet again. There was originally a question of whether or not they would do that. After his strong back-to-back performance against Tampa Bay and then New Jersey, it seemed as though Askarov could be someone that the Sharks would have stick around for pretty much the rest of this season. But at this point, it feels as though they're kind of like mortgaging the rest of this year, at least like from a Mike Grier standpoint. Let Askarov go back down to the Barracuda, who do kind of need him to be back there, considering they have not been all that great as of late, but that's the topic for a different video. And so Georgiev, the secondary reasoning here would also be to try and kind of work his value back up, and honestly, Georgiev actually played relatively well here tonight. The first goal from Fantilli, he didn't really have much of a chance on. The Van Riemsdyk goal, he absolutely didn't have much of a chance on. This Kent Johnson one, you could say, like, yeah, obviously this one does squeak through, but it was also like a cross-ice pass, so it's a bit difficult to get there and get fully set, so I won't blame him too much there. And honestly, he made some decent saves here tonight, so you can't be all that upset. But as I mentioned, it does seem as though the Sharks are going to be riding with him, at least until the deadline rolls around. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they'll be taking on the New York Islanders for the first time this season, if I am not mistaken. Now, unlike these previous couple of games where the Red Wings came in on a 7-game winning streak. The Blue Jackets came in on a 5-game winning streak. The Islanders have been a little bit more middling, though they have been a bit better as of late as well. So we shall see if the Sharks can handle them a bit better. We know that they are not quite in the playoff picture. The Islanders are. They're maybe a bit too far out at this point, but you never know. They're going to be playing for something still. Class dismissed.